Well, good morning. I'm so glad you chose to connect with us again. Today we're concluding a series entitled Finding Hope in a Time of Crisis. And today is the final message in a 3-week series. Now, we're always in need of hope. I mean, before this crisis happened, you were in need of hope. You had trials and struggles and difficulties, and you needed hope for what lies ahead. And someday this crisis will be over, and you're still going to need hope, because you're still going to have trials and troubles. And you need hope for what lies ahead. That's what this series is about. And I want to, again, focus on the word hope. There are two usages of the word hope. One is the common usage, which is this: wishful thinking about what might happen in the future. I hope this crisis ends in 2 weeks. Well, that's wishful thinking about what might happen in the future, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's another usage of the word hope that's unique to the Bible, and it is this: it's a hope that is a certain expectation of what will happen in the future. My hope is in the return of Christ. That's a certain expectation of what I know will happen in the future because God has revealed that. I know for sure that it's going to happen. And this hope is what this series is about. Now, Peter speaks of this hope in a verse that we've looked at all 3 weeks. As here it is again on our 3rd week. Peter says, "Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, the revelation of Jesus Christ is a reference to the return of Christ. And to fix your hope on the grace to be brought to you at the return of Christ is to fix your hope on the good things that are going to happen when Christ returns. Peter says, fix your hope completely on that grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul also speaks of this hope a number of times, but today we're going to see where he speaks of it in Romans chapter 8, verse 25. He says, "If we hope for what we do not see, we wait eagerly for it." Clearly, Paul is talking about a constant, certain expectation of what he knows is going to happen in the future. He eagerly waits for it, and we do too. Even though we can't see it, we're confident that it's going to happen. Now, what does Paul have in mind here? What hope is he referring to in verse 25? Well, he's referring to a hope that he already talked about back in verse 17. And verse 17 is the focus of what I want to share with you this morning. Here it is. "If children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ if we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together with him." Now you notice there are 2 parts to the verse. It's one verse, it's one sentence, but 2 distinct parts, and I want to deal with each part of the verse one at a time. So let's single out the first part, Romans 8:17a. "If children, then heirs, heirs of God." Now what we learn from that statement is that children of God can have a certain expectation of an inheritance from our Father in heaven one day. Children of God are going to receive an inheritance from our Father because he loves us and can't wait to give us that inheritance on a future day. Now, we need to think now for a moment, well, who are the children of God? It's likely that you've heard it said, well, we're all God's children. The problem is that's not what God says. God has revealed through John, who was a close friend and follower of Jesus, in the Gospel of John, that we're not all God's children. Only some are God's children. Here's how John puts it in John 1:12. "He gave the right to become children of God to those who believe in his name." We're not all God's children. You have to be given the right to become a child of God, and only some have been given that right. Who are they? Those that have believed in his name. The name of Jesus, as we learn in the context of the Gospel of John. But what's it mean to believe in his name? Well, Jesus explains that to us, and John wrote it down for us in John chapter 6, verse 47, where Jesus said, "He who believes in me has everlasting life." Everlasting life is life with God that lasts forever. The one who has everlasting life is the one who has believed in Jesus. Now, it's clear that it's not to believe anything about Jesus, but something specific about Jesus, which is found right there in that statement. That he gives everlasting life to the one who simply believes in him for it. And notice Jesus said, "He who believes in me has," present tense, right now. Everlasting life doesn't begin when you die. It begins the moment that you believe in him for that life. You're a child of God if you believe this. If you're convinced that it's true that Jesus gives everlasting life to the one who just believes in him for it, and that you have it now and you can never lose it, then you're a child of God. And this statement that Paul makes is true of you. You're a child of God. You're an heir of God. God has an inheritance for you that you're going to receive on a future day. Now, what is this inheritance that Paul has in mind? Well, he tells us a few verses later in verse 21, Romans 8:21. "Delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." Notice, children of God. He mentions children of God here. He's mentioning children of God here. What's he saying about children of God here? There's coming a day, and you can count on it, that if you're a child of God, you will be brought into the glorious liberty. You're going to experience glorious liberation from what? The bondage of corruption. You will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into this glorious liberty. What does he mean by the bondage of corruption? Well, Paul's been talking about that throughout Romans, but he's talking about it even in chapter 8. The bondage of corruption is the bondage of sin in our daily life. Now, every one of us, starting with me and including you, struggle with sin. Every one of us. Now, there are many different kinds of sin, but we all struggle with sin in some way. Maybe it's that you struggle with anger, or you struggle with resentment, or you struggle with impatience, or you struggle with complaining about things in life. Maybe you struggle with lust, or you struggle with envy. There's a whole long list of sins that people struggle with, and we all struggle with something in our lives. But one day, here's the good news. One day, children of God are going to be delivered from that bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of having no more sin. Living without sin in the presence of God in his kingdom. And that liberty, that glorious liberty, will last forever. And that is the inheritance that God has awaiting you, to be set free from the bondage of corruption. Now, let's go back and just look at the verse by itself again, or the first part of the verse. If children, then heirs, heirs of God. Every child of God can have a certain expectation of that basic inheritance from God. But that's not the end of the verse. Here's what the verse goes on to say. And joint heirs with Christ, if we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together with him. So if you're a child of God, it's possible you have the potential to become not just a child, but a joint heir with Christ. Now, a joint heir with Christ has not just a basic inheritance, but a bonus inheritance. For what? For suffering with him. Now, we know that to be a joint heir with Christ is not equal to being a child, because the only condition for being a child is to believe in Jesus. But the condition for being a joint heir is quite different. The condition for being a joint heir is to suffer with him, and that's not the same as just simply believing. And I'm going to elaborate more on what it means to suffer with him later in this message, but first I want to focus on what does it mean to be a joint heir with Christ.